Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having us. I want to introduce Weldon. And Weldon, I would just like you to tell us briefly about your story.
Yeah, I would say in the mid-90s, I was working on a career in the music industry, and I was able to actually work with the people I grew up listening to, like Snoop Dogg and Tupac Shakur's recording group. Unfortunately, while I was waiting for my music ventures to stabilize, I was also selling small amounts of cannabis. And on 3 occasions, I sold $300 worth to a confidential informant. 6 months later, federal prosecutors charged me in a 20-count federal indictment that required a 105-year mandatory minimum. Because prosecutors were unwilling to offer a reasonable plea offer, I was forced to trial, and I was convicted on most counts and ended up with a 55-year mandatory minimum. It was a sentence so extreme, even the judge, who was a conservative George W. Bush appointee and member of the Federalist Society, to decry the punishment as cruel, unjust, and even irrational. But because his hands were tied, all he could do was go down kicking and screaming. Ultimately, he left the bench and became one of my #1 advocates. He was joined by people like Senator Mike Lee, Senator Rand Paul, and even Cory Booker to call on President Obama for a commutation of sentence. The political figures were joined by some folks I worked with in the music industry like Snoop Dogg, Alicia Keys, and Bonnie Raitt. Ultimately, in May of 2016, we were successful and I was released from prison after serving 13 years. When I got out, I knew I wanted to be an advocate because I left a lot of people behind that had worse circumstances than mine. And so we started working with the Trump administration on the First Step Act. And in December of 2018, we were successful, and the law that gave me 55 years was finally reformed.
So what is Mission Green and the Weldon Project?
So after we passed the First Step Act, I wanted to shift my attention to individuals who are charged with nonviolent cannabis offenses. Currently, half the country is selling cannabis legally, and there are still people left in federal prison serving decades-long sentences for outdated criminal justice laws. And Mission Green and the Weldon Project seeks to end incarceration for low-level cannabis offenses, help release people who are still incarcerated, and create pathways to expungement and pardons so that they may go on to live successful lives.
What are some of the problems with our current criminal justice system?
So my judge said it best. He said that Congress has essentially said that rape, murder, terrorism are all bad, but drug dealing's far worse. And so, like in my situation, I got 55 years for $900 worth of cannabis as a first-time nonviolent offender, while my judge sentenced a murderer to a maximum of 17 years. He also noted that the rapist of a 10-year-old child could receive a maximum sentence of 11 years. He also noted that a terrorist would receive a maximum of 24 years. So I received a sentence that a child-raping terrorist would receive for 3 small marijuana transactions. That's ridiculous.
I completely agree. Can you explain a little bit about minimum sentencing and stacking?
Absolutely. So mandatory minimums are laws that require the judge to impose a minimum number of years regardless of the individual circumstances. For instance, in my situation, I got a mandatory 25-year enhancement under these mandatory minimums just because I owned a legal firearm in a gun safe in my house when I was arrested. Marijuana's illegality required my judge to impose 25 extra years for exercising my Second Amendment right. Judges have no discretion when it comes to mandatory sentencing, and that's why we need to reform it. Mandatory minimums put the discretion in the hands of the prosecutor rather than the judge, who is more trained in the exercise of discretion.
On a federal and state level, what do you think our country should do to fix some of these issues?
I think we need to first give judges discretion to judge. Prosecutors often are sometimes younger than the defendant, and they don't have that that experience in exercising judgment like judges do. So we definitely need to change mandatory sentences, and we need to reform our cannabis laws. I think those are the most important issues right now.
What are some important factors that should be considered regarding cannabis legislation on the state and federal level?
So currently, we have a two-tiered system of justice. Our federal system allows state operators across the country to profit off cannabis, despite violating federal law. Currently, the federal system still has around 3,000 people who are serving 20, 30, 40 years for nonviolent, low-level cannabis offenses. And both sides are violating federal law. Federal law does not recognize state law. And so this is an injustice. And so the federal system definitely needs to put the discretion in the states and let the states decide how to implement their own cannabis laws if they choose to do so.
For the state legislators here with a strong desire to further sentencing reforms, what do you say the biggest obstacle in that battle would be?
I would say right now, the crime rate has risen, especially around murders. And so it makes it really difficult to pass sentencing reform because of that. And what advocates are asking for, we're not asking for lower sentences for murderers and violent offenders. We're asking for lower sentences for nonviolent drug offenses. And I think that's a big obstacle right now because of that crime rate keeps rising.
Is there anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I would just say for the state legislators out there to really think about cannabis reform. State after state is continuing to legalize, and even in those states that don't want cannabis laws in their state, we need to do something on the criminal justice side. We can't have entrepreneurs in one state and then in another state they're considered criminal.
I agree. Well, thank you so much, Weldon.
Yeah, thanks.